Welcome to A1 Storyteller, where every story has a purpose and every word carries weight. Here at A1 Storyteller, we believe in the transformative power of storytelling. Whether it's tales of triumph over adversity, gripping narratives that challenge societal norms, or stories that expose injustices, our mission is to bring you content that inspires thought, sparks conversation, and drives change. Each episode is crafted with care, aiming to connect deeply with you, our valued audience, while shedding light on issues that matter most. Today we delve into a story that captures the essence of courage, accountability, and justice. It's a tale that begins with tension, unfolds with resilience, and concludes with a powerful message about equality and integrity. This is not just another story, it's a reflection of the world we live in and a call to action for all of us to do better. So sit back, immerse yourself, and let us take you on a journey through words that will stay with you long after the final sentence. In a bustling city known for its vibrant culture and diverse population, an incident unfolded that would shake the foundations of trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. At the center of this story stands Director Evelyn Carter, a trailblazer in her field and the first Black woman to lead the Federal Bureau of Investigation's regional office. Known for her unwavering dedication to justice and her ability to navigate complex challenges, Evelyn had earned respect across the nation. Yet even she could not have anticipated the harrowing encounter she was about to face. It was a crisp autumn morning when Evelyn stepped out of her car near a quiet suburban neighborhood. She had been called to oversee a high-profile investigation involving allegations of corruption within local police ranks. Dressed in her signature tailored suit and carrying credentials that spoke volumes of her authority, Evelyn exuded confidence as she approached the scene. What should have been a routine visit quickly spiraled into chaos. When two officers arrived on the scene, their body language tense and their intentions unclear. The officers, clad in full tactical gear, approached Evelyn without acknowledging her position or rank. Their eyes narrowed as they assessed her presence, their suspicion palpable. One officer barked orders, demanding identification despite the clear insignia on her badge holder. Evelyn remained calm, presenting her credentials with deliberate precision. But instead of diffusing the situation, the officers grew more agitated. Their voices rose, their tone laced with hostility, and soon one of them drew his weapon, pointing it squarely at Evelyn. Time seemed to freeze. The sound of traffic faded into the background as Evelyn locked eyes with the barrel of the gun. Her heart raced, but years of training kicked in. She stood firm, refusing to let fear dictate her actions. "I am Director Evelyn Carter of the FBI," she stated firmly, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Lower your weapon." But the officer did not comply. Instead, he sneered, making derogatory remarks that left no doubt about the underlying prejudice fueling his behavior. His partner joined in, mocking her title and questioning her legitimacy. For a moment, it felt as though the entire world had turned against her. Yet Evelyn refused to back down. With every ounce of strength, she demanded accountability, knowing that this moment was bigger than herself. It was a test of whether justice could prevail in the face of systemic bias. As bystanders began recording the altercation, news of the incident spread like wildfire. Social media erupted with outrage, hashtags calling for justice trending nationwide. People from all walks of life voiced their support for Evelyn, condemning the blatant display of racism and abuse of power. Calls for immediate action reverberated through the corridors of power, reaching the highest levels of government. The pressure mounted, forcing authorities to respond swiftly. Within hours, both officers were suspended, pending an internal investigation. However, public demand for accountability only intensified. Protesters gathered outside police headquarters, holding signs that read, "Justice for Evelyn," and chanting slogans that echoed the need for reform. Community leaders, civil rights activists, and politicians alike joined forces, amplifying the call for transparency and fairness. The sheer magnitude of the outcry made it impossible for officials to ignore. Finally, in a landmark decision, the officers involved were terminated from their positions. The announcement sent shockwaves throughout the country, signaling a pivotal shift in how such incidents are addressed. While some hailed the move as a step toward progress, Others argued that it was merely the beginning of a much-needed overhaul of institutional practices. Regardless, the firing of the officers marked a turning point, a moment when society collectively said enough was enough. For Evelyn, the aftermath of the incident brought a mix of emotions. On one hand, she felt vindicated by the outcome, grateful for the overwhelming support she received. On the other hand, she couldn't shake the lingering sense of vulnerability that came with being targeted simply because of who she was. Determined to channel her experience into something meaningful, Evelyn became an advocate for change. She used her platform to push for reforms within law enforcement agencies, emphasizing the importance of diversity, sensitivity training, and accountability measures. Her efforts resonated far beyond her immediate circle. Inspired by her courage, countless individuals shared their own stories of discrimination and injustice, creating a ripple effect that sparked conversations in homes, workplaces, and legislative chambers. Evelyn's ordeal became a catalyst for broader discussions about race, privilege, and systemic inequality. It forced people to confront uncomfortable truths and challenge them to envision a future where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. Yet, the road ahead remained fraught with challenges. Resistance to change persisted, with critics dismissing calls for reform as unnecessary or exaggerated. Some argued that isolated incidents shouldn't overshadow the good work done by the majority of officers. Others claimed that addressing systemic issues required more than just punitive measures. It demanded a fundamental shift in mindset and culture. Despite these obstacles, Evelyn remained steadfast in her mission, knowing that true progress often comes from perseverance in the face of adversity. As weeks turned into months, the impact of Evelyn's story continued to unfold. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at increasing oversight of law enforcement agencies, mandating body cameras, and implementing stricter penalties for misconduct. Educational institutions incorporated discussions about racial bias and policing into their curricula, ensuring that future generations would be better equipped to tackle these issues. Meanwhile, grassroots movements gained momentum, empowering communities to hold those in power accountable. Helen herself became a symbol of hope and resilience. Invited to speak at conferences, universities, and community forums, she shared her journey with audiences eager to learn from her experiences. Her speeches were filled with wisdom and passion, urging listeners to embrace empathy and stand up for what is right. Through her advocacy work, she inspired countless individuals to become agents of change in their own spheres of influence. However, Evelyn never lost sight of the fact that her battle was part of a larger struggle, one that transcended personal victories and required collective effort. She understood that dismantling systemic racism and fostering genuine equality would take time, patience, and unwavering commitment. And so she pressed on, driven by the belief that every small victory contributed to a greater cause. In reflecting on the events that transpired, Evelyn often found herself marveling at the power of unity. What started as a single act of defiance had blossomed into a movement that touched lives across the globe. It reminded her that even in the darkest moments, there is always light to be found. In the kindness of strangers, the solidarity of allies, and the indomitable spirit of those who refuse to give up. For Evelyn, this realization reinforced her faith in humanity and strengthened her resolve to keep fighting for a better tomorrow. As the sun set on another day, Evelyn sat in her office, surrounded by mementos of her journey. Photographs of loved ones adorned the walls, alongside awards and accolades that celebrated her achievements. Yet it wasn't these tangible reminders that gave her the greatest sense of fulfillment. It was the knowledge that her story had ignited a spark, a flame that burned brightly in the hearts of those committed to creating a fairer, more inclusive world. And so, the legacy of Evelyn Carter lived on, not just as a testament to her individual bravery, but as a beacon of hope for generations to come. Her story served as a reminder that while the fight for justice may be long and arduous, it is a fight worth waging, because in the end it is not just about changing systems or policies, it is about transforming hearts and minds, one story at a time. To fully understand the gravity of Evelyn Carter's encounter with the officers, it is essential to delve deeper into the systemic issues that allowed such an incident to occur. Racism within law enforcement is not a new phenomenon. It has been a persistent stain on the fabric of justice systems worldwide. Historical precedents reveal patterns of discriminatory practices, unequal treatment, and the disproportionate targeting of marginalized communities. These patterns are not isolated incidents, but symptoms of a broader problem embedded within the structures of policing. One of the most glaring examples of systemic racism in law enforcement is the practice of racial profiling. For decades, studies have shown that Black, Indigenous, and other people of color are disproportionately stopped, searched, and arrested compared to their white counterparts. This disparity is not due to higher rates of criminal activity, but rather to implicit biases held by officers and institutional policies that perpetuate stereotypes. In many cases, these encounters escalate unnecessarily, leading to violence or fatalities that devastate families and communities. The roots of this issue can be traced back to the origins of modern policing itself. In the United States, for instance, early forms of law enforcement were often tied to slave patrols and the enforcement of Jim Crow laws, systems explicitly designed to control and oppress Black populations. While overtly racist policies have since been abolished, their legacy persists in subtle yet insidious ways. Training programs, hiring practices, and organizational cultures within police departments frequently fail to address these deep-seated biases, allowing them to fester unchecked. Moreover, accountability remains a significant obstacle in combating systemic racism within law enforcement. Officers accused of misconduct are often shielded by qualified immunity, union protections, and opaque disciplinary processes that make it difficult to hold them accountable for their actions. Even when egregious violations occur, investigations are frequently conducted internally, raising concerns about impartiality and transparency. This lack of accountability erodes public trust and reinforces the perception that law enforcement operates above the law. Another critical factor is the militarization of police forces. Over the past several decades, many departments have adopted military-grade equipment and tactics, ostensibly to combat rising crime rates or respond to emergencies. However, this approach has disproportionately affected communities of color, where heavily armed officers are deployed under the guise of maintaining order. The result is an atmosphere of fear and intimidation, further alienating residents and exacerbating tensions between law enforcement and the communities they are meant to serve. These systemic issues create an environment ripe for incidents like the one involving Evelyn Carter. When officers harbor implicit biases or operate within institutions that normalize discriminatory behavior, they are more likely to view individuals from marginalized groups as threats, even when those individuals hold positions of authority. In Evelyn's case, her identity as a Black woman likely triggered unconscious prejudices that clouded the officers' judgment, leading them to disregard her credentials and escalate the situation unnecessarily. Furthermore, the incident highlights the intersectionality of racism and sexism. As a Black woman in a leadership role, Evelyn faced dual layers of bias. Not only was she subjected to racial stereotyping, but she also encountered gender-based assumptions that questioned her competence and authority. This double bind is a common experience for women of color in positions of power who must constantly prove themselves in environments that are inherently hostile to their presence. Addressing these systemic issues requires a multifaceted approach. First and foremost, there needs to be a concerted effort to diversify law enforcement agencies. Studies have shown that departments with greater representation from minority groups tend to have fewer complaints of misconduct and stronger relationships with the communities they serve. Recruitment strategies should prioritize inclusivity, ensuring that candidates from underrepresented backgrounds are given equal opportunities to join and advance within the ranks. Training programs must also evolve to address implicit bias and cultural competency. Current models often focus on technical skills and legal procedures, neglecting the psychological and social dynamics that influence officer behavior. By incorporating modules on empathy, de-escalation techniques, and the history of systemic racism, departments can equip officers with the tools they need to interact respectfully and effectively with all members of the community. Accountability mechanisms must be strengthened to ensure that officers who engage in discriminatory or abusive behavior face appropriate consequences. This includes revisiting policies around qualified immunity, establishing independent oversight bodies, and implementing transparent disciplinary processes. Public access to data on police conduct and use of force is also crucial, as it allows for external scrutiny and holds departments accountable for their actions. Finally, there needs to be a cultural shift within law enforcement agencies themselves. Leadership plays a pivotal role in shaping organizational values and setting expectations for behavior. Chiefs and commanders must actively promote anti-racist principles, foster open dialogue about bias and privilege, and model the kind of respectful interactions they wish to see among their officers. Only through sustained commitment at every level can meaningful change be achieved. Evelyn Carter's story underscores the urgent need for reform. It serves as a stark reminder that systemic racism is not an abstract concept but a lived reality for millions of people. Until these underlying issues are addressed, incidents like hers will continue to occur, perpetuating cycles of mistrust and division. The path forward is challenging, but it is also necessary. By confronting these systemic flaws head-on, we can begin to build a future where justice truly serves all. As Evelyn Carter navigated the aftermath of the harrowing incident, she found herself at the epicenter of a storm that extended far beyond her personal experience. The public reaction to the event was swift and seismic, sparking a wave of outrage, solidarity, and demands for accountability that rippled across the nation. Social media platforms became battlegrounds of discourse, with hashtags like Justice for Evelyn and Racism in Blue dominating timelines. Videos of the altercation, captured by bystanders, went viral, drawing millions of views and igniting impassioned debates about race, power, and the role of law enforcement in society. The sheer scale of the response was unprecedented. Activists, celebrities, and everyday citizens took to digital spaces to express their support for Evelyn and condemn the officer's actions. Memes, infographics, and heartfelt posts flooded feeds, amplifying the narrative and ensuring that the story reached corners of the internet typically untouched by such discussions. Online petitions calling for the immediate termination of the officers garnered hundreds of thousands of signatures within days, underscoring the collective desire for justice. Meanwhile, community organizers mobilized offline, planning rallies and vigils in cities across the country to honor Evelyn's courage and demand systemic reform. Traditional media outlets quickly picked up the story, devoting primetime segments and front-page headlines to the unfolding drama. News anchors debated the implications of the incident, inviting experts, activists, and former law enforcement officials to weigh in on the broader context of racial bias in policing. Talk shows and podcasts dedicated entire episodes to dissecting the footage, analyzing the officer's behavior, and exploring the psychological toll such encounters take on victims. The saturation of coverage ensured that Evelyn's name became synonymous with resilience and resistance, elevating her from a respected figure in law enforcement to a national symbol of the fight against systemic racism. Politicians, too, were compelled to respond. Local, state, and federal lawmakers issued statements condemning the officer's actions and pledging to pursue legislative remedies. Congressional hearings were convened to examine the prevalence of racial profiling and excessive force within police departments. Lawmakers grilled representatives from law enforcement agencies, demanding answers and accountability. Bills aimed at increasing transparency, mandating body cameras, and implementing stricter penalties for misconduct gained traction, fueled by the momentum of public outcry. For the first time in years, bipartisan support emerged for sweeping reforms, signaling a potential turning point in the ongoing struggle for equitable policing. Corporate America also played a role in amplifying the conversation. Major companies released statements denouncing racism and reaffirming their commitment to diversity and inclusion. Some went further, donating funds to organizations advocating for police reform, and launching initiatives to educate employees about systemic inequality. Advertisements featuring messages of unity and empowerment began airing during peak television hours, reflecting the growing recognition that businesses have a responsibility to contribute to societal progress. While critics accused some corporations of performative activism, the visibility of these efforts nonetheless helped sustain the national dialogue. At the grassroots level, the response was equally profound. Community groups organized workshops, town halls, and educational sessions to address the root causes of racial bias and explore solutions. Schools incorporated discussions about the incident into their curricula, encouraging students to reflect on themes of justice, equality, and civic engagement. Artists created murals, poems, and songs inspired by Evelyn's story, using their craft to channel emotion into action. The convergence of these efforts demonstrated the power of collective mobilization, proving that ordinary people could drive extraordinary change when united by a common cause. For Evelyn, the overwhelming support was both humbling and empowering. Messages of encouragement poured in from strangers who saw themselves in her struggle, sharing their own stories of discrimination and resilience. Letters from young girls aspiring to careers in law enforcement reminded her of the importance of representation and the impact her actions could have on future generations. Yet, amidst the praise and admiration, Evelyn remained acutely aware of the burden placed upon her shoulders. She knew that her position as a high-profile figure came with an obligation to leverage her platform for the greater good, a responsibility she embraced wholeheartedly. Determined to channel the energy of the movement into tangible outcomes, Evelyn partnered with advocacy organizations to launch a nationwide campaign focused on police reform. The initiative, titled Justice Beyond the Badge, sought to address the systemic issues exposed by her ordeal, while providing resources and support to those affected by similar incidents. Key components of the campaign included lobbying for policy changes, offering free legal assistance to victims of police misconduct, and hosting forums to facilitate dialogue between law enforcement agencies and the communities they serve. By combining grassroots activism with strategic advocacy, Evelyn aimed to create lasting change that extended beyond symbolic gestures. Her efforts were met with enthusiasm and collaboration. Civil rights groups, labor unions, and faith-based organizations joined forces to amplify the campaign's reach and impact. Celebrities lent their voices to fundraising efforts, participating in benefit concerts and auctions to raise money for affected families and community programs. Influencers used their platforms to share educational content and encourage followers to get involved, further broadening the campaign's audience. The synergy between these diverse stakeholders underscored the interconnectedness of the fight for justice, highlighting the potential for unity in the face of adversity. Despite the widespread support, Evelyn faced criticism from certain quarters. Skeptics accused her of exploiting the incident for personal gain, questioning whether her advocacy was motivated by genuine concern or a desire for publicity. Others dismissed the campaign as overly ambitious, arguing that systemic change was an unrealistic goal given the entrenched nature of institutional racism. Evelyn acknowledged these critiques, recognizing that no movement is immune to dissent. Rather than letting negativity deter her, she viewed it as an opportunity to refine her approach and address legitimate concerns. Transparency, authenticity, and inclusivity became guiding principles as she worked to build trust and credibility. The ripple effects of the incident extended internationally, drawing attention from global audiences attuned to issues of racial injustice. News outlets in Europe, Africa, and Asia covered the story, framing it within the broader context of racial inequality and police brutality. International human rights organizations condemned the officers' actions, calling on governments worldwide to examine their own law enforcement practices. Solidarity protests erupted in cities like London, Johannesburg, and Sydney, with demonstrators holding signs bearing Evelyn's name and chanting slogans that echoed the universal demand for equity and accountability. The global response underscored the universality of the struggle against systemic racism, reinforcing the idea that the fight for justice knows no borders. As weeks turned into months, the movement inspired by Evelyn's experience continued to evolve. New alliances formed, innovative strategies emerged, and previously marginalized voices found space to be heard. The incident that began as a single act of defiance had grown into a multifaceted crusade for transformation, touching lives and reshaping perspectives in ways Evelyn could never have imagined. Though the journey was far from over, the momentum generated by the public reaction offered a glimmer of hope, a testament to the enduring power of collective action and the unyielding pursuit of justice. The firing of the officers involved in the incident with Evelyn Carter marked a watershed moment in the ongoing struggle for accountability within law enforcement. It was a decision that carried profound implications, not only for the individuals directly involved but also for the broader landscape of policing and public trust. The swift termination of the officers sent a clear message: actions rooted in racism and abuse of power would no longer be tolerated, regardless of rank or affiliation. Yet while the firings represented a significant step forward, they also raised complex questions about the mechanisms of accountability, the role of systemic reform, and the delicate balance between discipline and rehabilitation. From a legal standpoint, the termination of the officers adhered to established protocols governing misconduct within law enforcement agencies. Internal investigations revealed irrefutable evidence of gross negligence, including the unjustified use of lethal force, failure to follow proper identification procedures, and the use of racially charged language. These findings aligned with departmental codes of conduct, which explicitly prohibit behaviors that undermine public confidence or violate civil rights. The severity of the offenses warranted immediate dismissal, bypassing lesser forms of punishment such as suspension or reassignment. Legal experts praised the decision as a demonstration of zero tolerance for discriminatory practices, emphasizing that accountability must extend to all levels of law enforcement. However, the legal ramifications extended beyond the officers' terminations. Criminal charges were filed against them, ranging from assault with a deadly weapon to violating civil rights statutes. Prosecutors argued that the officers' actions constituted reckless endangerment and constituted a breach of Evelyn's constitutional protections. The case garnered national attention, with courtroom proceedings broadcast live and dissected by legal analysts. Defense attorneys countered that the officers acted under duress, citing the high-pressure nature of their jobs and the split-second decisions required in volatile situations. They also attempted to cast doubt on the authenticity of the bystander footage, alleging potential tampering or misrepresentation. Despite these arguments, the prosecution presented a compelling case, bolstered by eyewitness testimonies, forensic evidence, and expert analysis of police protocols. The trial became a litmus test for the judicial system's ability to hold law enforcement accountable, with millions watching to see whether justice would prevail. Ethically, the firings underscored the moral imperative to address systemic racism within policing. The officers' actions were not isolated incidents but symptomatic of deeper issues embedded within institutional cultures. Ethicists pointed out that the decision to terminate them was not merely punitive but restorative, aimed at rebuilding public trust and affirming the values of fairness and equality. By taking decisive action, law enforcement agencies signaled their willingness to confront uncomfortable truths and commit to meaningful change. This ethical stance resonated with advocates who had long argued that accountability is a cornerstone of justice. It also set a precedent for future cases, establishing a benchmark for how similar incidents should be handled. From a societal perspective, the firings ignited a renewed debate about the role of law enforcement in modern society. Critics of the decision argued that terminating officers without addressing underlying systemic issues amounted to treating symptoms rather than curing the disease. They contended that true reform required a holistic approach, encompassing changes in training, recruitment, and community engagement. Others expressed concern that the firings might discourage officers from making difficult decisions in high-stakes situations, potentially compromising public safety. These perspectives highlighted the complexity of balancing accountability with the practical realities of policing. Conversely, supporters of the firings viewed them as a necessary step toward dismantling oppressive systems. They emphasized that accountability must start with individual responsibility before broader reforms can take root. For many, the terminations represented a rare instance of justice being served, offering a sense of vindication for communities that had endured decades of systemic neglect and abuse. The firings also galvanized grassroots movements, inspiring activists to push for additional measures such as independent oversight boards, mandatory de-escalation training, and increased transparency in disciplinary processes. The psychological impact of the firings cannot be overlooked. For Evelyn Carter, the decision brought a measure of closure, validating her experience and affirming her dignity. Yet, it also reignited the trauma of the incident, forcing her to relive the fear and humiliation she endured. Mental health professionals noted that such experiences often leave lasting scars, particularly for individuals from marginalized communities who face repeated exposure to discrimination and violence. The firings underscored the need for comprehensive support systems, including counseling services and peer networks, to help victims cope with the emotional toll of such encounters. For the officers themselves, the firings marked the end of their careers and reputations. Stripped of their badges and facing criminal charges, they became pariahs within their profession and their communities. Some expressed remorse, acknowledging the harm caused by their actions and pledging to seek redemption. Others doubled down on their defenses, blaming systemic failures or external pressures for their behavior. Their contrasting responses reflected the polarizing nature of the incident, mirroring the broader societal divide over issues of race, authority, and accountability. Ultimately, the firings served as a catalyst for change, prompting introspection and dialogue at every level of society. Law enforcement agencies began revisiting their policies and practices, implementing reforms aimed at preventing similar incidents in the future. Policymakers introduced legislation to enhance oversight and accountability, while educators incorporated lessons about systemic racism into their curricula. Communities engaged in honest conversations about race and privilege, striving to bridge divides and foster mutual understanding. Though the road ahead remained fraught with challenges, the firings represented a pivotal moment, a turning point in the quest for a more just and equitable society. In the wake of the harrowing incident that thrust her into the national spotlight, Evelyn Carter emerged not only as a survivor, but as a leader determined to channel her pain into purpose. The experience left an indelible mark on her, shaping her perspective and propelling her into a new chapter of advocacy, no longer content to operate solely within the confines of her role as an FBI director. Evelyn embraced a broader mission: to dismantle the systemic barriers that had nearly cost her life, and to champion a vision of justice that transcended institutional boundaries. One of Evelyn's first steps was to establish the Equity in Justice Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to addressing racial bias and promoting accountability within law enforcement. Drawing on her extensive experience in investigative work and policy reform, Evelyn assembled a team of experts, including criminologists, civil rights attorneys, and community organizers, to develop evidence-based strategies for systemic change. The initiative focused on three key pillars: education, advocacy, and collaboration. Through workshops and training programs, the organization sought to educate officers about implicit bias, cultural competency, and de-escalation techniques. Simultaneously, it advocated for legislative reforms, working closely with lawmakers to draft bills that mandated transparency, body cameras, and independent oversight boards. Finally, the initiative fostered partnerships between law enforcement agencies and the communities they served, facilitating dialogues aimed at building trust and mutual respect. Evelyn's advocacy extended beyond policy reform to include grassroots mobilization. Recognizing the power of collective action, she traveled across the country speaking at rallies, town halls, and university campuses. Her speeches were a masterclass in resilience and conviction, blending personal anecdotes with hard-hitting statistics To illuminate the pervasive nature of systemic racism, she urged audiences to move beyond passive awareness and take active roles in driving change, whether through volunteering, voting, or engaging in difficult conversations with friends and family. Her charisma and authenticity resonated deeply, inspiring countless individuals to join the movement and amplify its message. Central to Evelyn's efforts was her emphasis on storytelling as a tool for transformation. She understood that narratives have the power to humanize abstract issues, bridging gaps in understanding and fostering empathy. To this end, she launched a podcast series titled Voices of Justice, where she interviewed survivors of police misconduct, activists, and reform-minded officers. Each episode shed light on different facets of the issue, from the psychological toll of racial profiling to the challenges of implementing meaningful reforms. The podcast quickly gained a loyal following, becoming a platform for marginalized voices to share their experiences and advocate for change. Evelyn also leveraged her position within the FBI to push for internal reforms. She spearheaded the creation of a diversity and inclusion task force, tasked with identifying and addressing biases within the agency's operations. The task force conducted audits of hiring practices, training programs, and disciplinary procedures, recommending changes to ensure equitable treatment for all employees. Additionally, Evelyn advocated for the implementation of community liaison programs, enabling FBI agents to engage directly with local populations and address concerns proactively. Her leadership earned her accolades from colleagues and superiors alike, solidifying her reputation as a trailblazer committed to integrity and fairness. Beyond her professional endeavors, Evelyn prioritized self-care and healing, recognizing that sustainable activism requires emotional resilience. She sought therapy to process the trauma of the incident, finding solace in the guidance of mental health professionals who specialized in racial trauma. She also leaned on her support network, including close friends, family members, and fellow advocates who provided encouragement and perspective during moments of doubt. This commitment to well-being allowed her to maintain her stamina and focus, ensuring that she could continue her work without succumbing to burnout. Evelyn's advocacy was not without its challenges. Critics accused her of overstepping her role as an FBI director, arguing that her activism undermined her impartiality. Others dismissed her efforts as performative, claiming that systemic change required more than individual initiatives. Despite these criticisms, Evelyn remained undeterred, viewing them as opportunities to refine her approach and address legitimate concerns. She invited feedback from skeptics, engaging in constructive dialogues that demonstrated her willingness to listen and adapt. This openness further endeared her to supporters who admired her humility and determination. Perhaps the most profound impact of Evelyn's advocacy was its ripple effect. Her courage inspired others to share their own stories of discrimination and resilience, creating a domino effect of empowerment. Young women of color in particular found inspiration in her example, seeing her as proof that leadership and authority are attainable, regardless of societal barriers. Schools and mentorship programs began incorporating her story into their curricula, using it as a case study in overcoming adversity and effecting change. Evelyn herself became a mentor, dedicating time to guide aspiring leaders and offer advice to those navigating similar challenges. As months turned into years, Evelyn's influence continued to grow. She authored a memoir detailing her journey, from her humble beginnings in Brooklyn to her rise as a national icon of justice. The book, titled Unyielding: A Journey Toward Equity, became a bestseller, praised for its raw honesty and actionable insights. Proceeds from the book funded scholarships for underrepresented students pursuing careers in law enforcement and criminal justice, furthering Evelyn's commitment to diversifying the field. Through it all, Evelyn remained grounded in her purpose. She understood that systemic change is a marathon, not a sprint, requiring patience, persistence, and unwavering faith in the possibility of progress. Her story became a testament to the power of resilience, reminding others that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, one person's courage can ignite a movement. And as she looked toward the future, Evelyn vowed to keep pushing forward, knowing that the fight for justice is far from over, but that every step taken brings us closer to a world where equity is not the exception, but the norm. The ripple effects of Evelyn Carter's ordeal extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the incident, leaving an indelible mark on society and igniting a wave of transformation that continues to resonate today. Her story became a touchstone for discussions about systemic racism, accountability, and the urgent need for reform within law enforcement. What began as a harrowing confrontation between a black woman in power and two prejudiced officers evolved into a catalyst for sweeping changes that touched every corner of the nation and beyond. One of the most profound impacts of Evelyn's experience was its role in reshaping public perception of law enforcement. For decades, police officers had been portrayed as guardians of peace and protectors of the vulnerable, their authority rarely questioned. Evelyn's encounter shattered this idealized image, exposing the cracks in a system that had long prioritized compliance over compassion and control over community. Media coverage of the incident forced viewers to confront uncomfortable truths about the ways in which systemic biases manifest in daily interactions between law enforcement and marginalized groups. Documentaries, investigative reports, and panel discussions dissected the footage of the altercation, highlighting not only the officers' egregious behavior, but also the broader patterns of discrimination that enabled such incidents to occur. This heightened awareness sparked a cultural reckoning, prompting individuals to reevaluate their assumptions about race, power, and privilege. The incident also galvanized grassroots movements, breathing new life into long-standing efforts to reform policing practices. Organizations like Black Lives Matter, Campaign Zero, and the ACLU saw a surge in membership and donations as people sought tangible ways to contribute to the cause. Protests and demonstrations became fixtures of urban landscapes, with marchers carrying banners emblazoned with Evelyn's name and chanting slogans that echoed her defiance. These gatherings were more than expressions of outrage. They were calls to action, demanding concrete policy changes and holding elected officials accountable for delivering results. Legislators responded by introducing a flurry of bills aimed at increasing transparency, mandating body cameras, and implementing stricter penalties for misconduct. Some states went further, passing laws to decertify officers guilty of serious offenses and banning chokeholds and other forms of excessive force. While critics argued that these measures fell short of addressing the root causes of systemic racism, they represented significant strides toward accountability and laid the groundwork for future reforms. Education systems also underwent a transformation in the wake of Evelyn's story. Schools and universities integrated discussions about racial bias and policing into their curricula, ensuring that future generations would be better equipped to recognize and challenge discriminatory practices. Textbooks were updated to include case studies of real-world incidents, while teachers received training on how to facilitate sensitive conversations about race and inequality. College campuses hosted symposiums and workshops, inviting experts, activists, and survivors of police misconduct to share their insights. These initiatives fostered a generation of informed citizens who understood the importance of equity and were prepared to advocate for it in their personal and professional lives. Corporate America, too, felt the reverberations of Evelyn's ordeal. Companies large and small began reassessing their diversity and inclusion policies, recognizing that systemic racism is not confined to law enforcement but permeates all aspects of society. Human resources departments implemented mandatory anti-bias training programs, while executives pledged to hire and promote more employees from underrepresented backgrounds. Marketing campaigns shifted to reflect a wider range of identities, celebrating diversity in ways that resonated with increasingly socially conscious consumers. Philanthropic arms of major corporations donated millions to organizations working to combat racial injustice, amplifying the resources available to grassroots activists. While some dismissed these efforts as performative, the cumulative impact of corporate involvement helped sustain the momentum of the movement. Internationally, Evelyn's story resonated with audiences grappling with their own struggles against systemic oppression. News outlets in countries as diverse as the United Kingdom, South Africa, and Australia covered the incident, framing it within the context of global conversations about race and inequality. Solidarity protests erupted in cities around the world, with demonstrators holding signs bearing Evelyn's name and chanting slogans that transcended language barriers. Human rights organizations seized the opportunity to draw attention to similar issues in their respective regions, calling on governments to examine their own law enforcement practices. The universal appeal of Evelyn's narrative underscored the shared nature of the fight against systemic racism, reinforcing the idea that justice is a global aspiration. Art and culture played a pivotal role in amplifying the impact of Evelyn's story. Filmmakers, musicians, and visual artists drew inspiration from her courage, creating works that captured the emotional weight of her experience while advocating for change. A critically acclaimed documentary chronicled her journey from victim to advocate, weaving together archival footage, interviews, and original music to tell a story of resilience and redemption. Musicians released anthems dedicated to her cause, their lyrics serving as rallying cries for those committed to the fight for justice. Murals depicting Evelyn's likeness appeared on walls in neighborhoods across the country, transforming public spaces into canvases of hope and defiance. These artistic expressions not only honored Evelyn's legacy, but also ensured that her story remained alive in the collective consciousness. Perhaps the most enduring impact of Evelyn's ordeal was its ability to inspire individual action. Countless people, moved by her courage, found ways to contribute to the movement in their own capacities. Teachers incorporated lessons about systemic racism into their classrooms, parents engaged their children in conversations about equality, and volunteers dedicated their time to mentoring young people from marginalized communities. Social media became a powerful tool for amplifying voices and organizing efforts, with hashtags like #BeLikeEvelyn encouraging users to embody her spirit of resilience and advocacy. Even small acts of kindness, such as supporting Black-owned businesses or attending local council meetings, became part of a larger tapestry of change, demonstrating that progress is built on the cumulative efforts of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. As the years passed, Evelyn's influence continued to shape the trajectory of the movement. Her advocacy inspired the creation of new organizations, policies, and initiatives aimed at addressing the root causes of systemic racism. Scholars wrote dissertations analyzing the socio-political implications of her story, while filmmakers adapted her memoir into a feature film that brought her journey to an even wider audience. Award ceremonies recognized her contributions to justice and equality, cementing her status as a cultural icon. Yet despite the accolades, Evelyn remained steadfast in her belief that true change requires collective effort. She often reminded audiences that her story was not unique. It was emblematic of the experiences of countless others who had faced similar injustices. By centering their voices and uplifting their struggles, she hoped to create a future where no one would have to endure what she had. In reflecting on the ripple effects of Evelyn's ordeal, it becomes clear that her story was more than a singular moment of triumph. It was a spark that ignited a firestorm of transformation. From shifting public perceptions to inspiring legislative reforms, from fostering generational change to uniting global movements, her courage reverberated across every facet of society. And though the journey toward equity remains incomplete, the legacy of her ordeal serves as a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is always light to be found in the power of resilience, the strength of unity, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. As the dust settled and the initial fervor surrounding Evelyn Carter's ordeal began to subside, the world was left to grapple with the enduring lessons embedded within her story. This was no mere tale of survival or triumph. It was a mirror held up to society, reflecting both its flaws and its potential for growth. Evelyn's journey illuminated the pervasive nature of systemic racism, the fragility of trust between law enforcement and marginalized communities, and the transformative power of resilience and collective action. These lessons, though born from a single incident, carry universal relevance, challenging us to confront uncomfortable truths and strive for a more equitable future. One of the most poignant takeaways from Evelyn's story is the insidious nature of systemic racism. Her encounter with the officers was not an isolated act of prejudice, but a manifestation of deeply ingrained biases that have shaped institutions for generations. It served as a stark reminder that racism is not always overt. It often lurks in the shadows, disguised as policy loopholes, implicit biases, or cultural norms. Evelyn's experience underscored the importance of recognizing these subtleties and addressing them head-on. Ignoring systemic racism or dismissing it